Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to the farm. Today we're going to continue with Volume 6 of our series on Why Stanley Kubrick? And, that's a good question. Why did I choose to talk about Stanley Kubrick? He's not even my favorite director in terms of movies that have impacted me the most. Stanley Kubrick's movies rank highly in my personal catalog of great films. But there are also a lot of entries by other filmmakers like Martin Scorsese or Paul Thomas Anderson. But Kubrick is fascinating because, especially at this point in his career, he has become this strange curiosity, this grumbling old man, this classic from the old studio system. And he's now crashing against a strange new world and colliding with its ideals. I see Kubrick in 1979 as a pillar of the artistic community, a man of substance and literature and age and experience from a life dedicated to the craft of filmmaking and the real technical skills involved. Because filmmaking is an art form, but it's also a very risky business venture. And so, unlike a painter or a novelist, the financial cost of their art and the risk involved was a huge part of the activity and was always first and foremost on their minds. Unlike Stephen King, who may have had trouble making ends meet in his personal life with his new family, he did not have to court a series of investors and sweet-talk them out of loans or deal with a bunch of studio execs who wanted control over your story. So people like Kubrick have to become businessmen to some extent. They have to become adept at financial gamesmanship, and they have to continually improve in terms of their approach to logistics and efficiency within the limits of their art. Now, as we've seen, there were definite limits to just how efficient Kubrick was willing to get in the production of the film. Now, we're going to be continuing our discussion of The Shining, and as promised, we're going to talk mostly about interpretations and theories. Who are these people? What were these characters intended to be? And what does the story mean? What does the ending mean? And do any of these wild theories about what The Shining actually means hold water? We're talking about things like the idea that The Shining is really about the genocide of the Native Americans, or the Holocaust, indicated in part by the creepy prevalence of the number 42, which is supposed to refer to the year 1942. But as we all learned from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the number 42 has an inherent cosmic significance that we don't really understand. And so the first little technical detail is really an acting technique. This is something that he told his actors to do. And I referred to it in our last episode, where I had Stanley Kubrick yelling at me to keep my head down and keep my eyes up. If you watch enough Stanley Kubrick movies, you'll see that this is something that he has the actors do at certain points of his films. And it's a very unnatural and memorable expression. And it fits right into Kubrick's philosophy, which we'll discuss later, about having things look more, quote, cinematic than just realistic or even just interesting. We see it briefly on the astronaut Dave Bowman's face as he passes through the Stargate at the end of 2001, thus indicating his extreme emotional state. Probably just fear and confusion, maybe mixed with a grim determination. We saw glimpses of it in Barry Lyndon, but I don't recall it being displayed in its full intensity at any point. We have to wait for The Shining for that, where we get it a lot. And it makes sense because this story is about a person losing their mind. And so we start to see it a lot in Jack. And briefly, we see it on Danny's face when he is in the depths of his shining seizures. So this head down, eyes up look is the first sign that Jack is in trouble, that the hotel is starting to have an effect on him. In fact, the last time we saw it was on the face of Alex DeLarge, the hero/villain of A Clockwork Orange. Then we saw it briefly on the face of a man who was consumed with a vengeful rage and wanted to hurt Alex DeLarge. And later, we'll see this Kubrick stare in Full Metal Jacket, when we see it emerge on the face of Private Leonard Lawrence, also known as Private Gomer Pyle. And we see this particular expression on his face right before the noxious gases from the excrement reach the electrical ventilation device. The next technical note I want to talk about is not a direction to the actors, but an unfortunate set of instructions that some unfortunate production assistants had to carry out before the shooting of a particular scene toward the end of the film. And by the way, Kubrick liked to shoot in chronological order as much as possible. I would agree with that. I think it makes things easier for the actors in order to maintain the proper progression of their characters throughout the film. But anyway, as many of you may recall, toward the end of the film, someone is looking through an entire ream of typical white office typewriter paper that has been typed over completely with the sentence, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." Now, I want to point out that this is the era before CGI, and I want to point out that Kubrick was clearly particular about the format of the typewritten work, and that he wanted it to be clearly typewritten by hand on a mechanical typewriter. And so he wanted slightly misaligned characters, he wanted a few typos, and he wanted the indentation and the structure of each page to be a little different. One page just has the sentence typed over and over and over again. Then another one is in script format. And then another one looks like a normal printed page with normal indented paragraphs from a distance, until you realize that it's all just the same sentence repeated over and over again. So I want to point out that basically Kubrick had to have some production assistants sit down with an old school manual typewriter, and I suppose each one was assigned a certain number of sheets of paper that they had to fill up with that one sentence in various positions.
Faster. Type faster. The way Jack would. Where are the typos? Where's the passion in the keystrokes? Just stop typing for 10 seconds. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. And get into the headspace of the character. Throw that page away. It looks fine, but you didn't type it with the ferocity that Jack would use. The audience can tell the difference. You type too well. Jack is not a good typist. Get clumsier. I don't like it. Yes, it's true you typed it like Jack. I saw you. It was very impressive. But the end result is bad. It looks too normal. It's gotta be scary.
And not only that, Kubrick was well aware that audiences who did not speak English would not understand why the character is so upset if they can't read what's on that page. So what does that mean? That means that Kubrick didn't want to leave his German or French or Japanese audiences hanging. So he had the pages also typed in all of the languages that the film would be dubbed in. So we have to imagine that in the German version of The Shining, this particular character looks at the page and they see the same sentence typed over and over again. And that sentence is, of course, Nur Arbeit und kein Spiel machen Jack zu einem langweiligen Jungen. And I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot scarier. Another couple of things I want to mention have to do with more strange choices that Kubrick made. Now, some of you may remember that there is one scene that happens in Florida, of all places. Sunny Florida, while Jack and his family are languishing through the long Colorado winter in the mountains. One employee of the hotel heads out for a little vacation, and we get to see the room that he's staying in. And it's not entirely clear whether this is some sort of hotel room or maybe a vacation home that he owns. But this room is peculiar. This room has some strange decor choices. And of course, there's a lot of brown, because, after all, this was shot in 1979. Now, there's also a lot of orange, which you would expect also, because it's the late 70s. But, boy, is there a lot of orange. And you might also be thinking, well, this is Florida. It's the orange capital of the world. Well, if you've read the book, which I have not, but apparently whenever this character's shining ability is activated, he smells oranges. So the smell of oranges alerts him to the fact that he's about to have a vision or receive some sort of message. So I suppose I can see the connection there. This person receives a powerful distress call via their shining ability. And so he's in a room that's just saturated with the color orange. Now, I gotta say, if the smell of oranges makes you think that you're having some sort of vision, Florida's not a good choice for a vacation home, I don't think. Too much opportunity for a false positive. I mean, somebody spills their beverage at the hotel's free breakfast. And then he starts shivering and looking at his brain, freaking everybody out. You wouldn't really want that. And that's a good example of Kubrick trying to express what's in King's novel on the screen, and that sometimes takes some work. Okay, now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Kubrick versus the actors. Kubrick was not the best director when it came to dealing with actors. I don't think he liked actors. I don't think he liked that kind of fearless, sometimes impulsive, hyper-expressive, sometimes volatile and overly performative personality that often comes along with extreme acting talent. There is something about people who are good on the screen and who are good at converting boring words typed out on a page in all caps Courier font and somehow make it engaging and sometimes even epic or iconic. Some directors, like Martin Scorsese, are committed to giving the actors their space. Scorsese says that he deliberately allows the actors and even encourages the actors to improvise, especially during rehearsals, to get a sense of the possibilities and the emotional space involved in the scene, and to get a sense of how the other actors are going to respond to certain behaviors. it ends up making the whole scene feel a lot more lived in and natural. And instead of exploring the possibilities and the frayed edges of the real human relationships involved, Kubrick would tend to just rely, I think, on an obsessive focus on what he had planned for the day, what he wrote on the page, and getting the actors to put that on the film. And it seems that Kubrick often didn't even have an idea of exactly what he wanted. He wasn't able to walk up to the actor and verbally describe exactly what he wants to see. Kubrick tried to give his scenes a lived-in feel and tried to get the actors to come out of their shell through sheer repetition and exhausting them, which I don't think produces the best results. Now, Kubrick would tend to cast by looking for a particular look or bearing without maybe looking deeper into the actor's background and their work experience and their range to see if they can really embody the person that Kubrick wants them to. Now, the interesting thing about the conflict with Shelley Duvall is that Kubrick not only hired her, he fought for her. As I said earlier, the studio wanted Jane Fonda, who would have been a more, I guess, forceful and vocal character who would oppose Jack Torrance at times when the Wendy that Kubrick gave us was very retiring and kind of waifish and fit the victim template. But as we'll see later, I'm going to argue against that. I'm going to argue that Shelley Duvall played Wendy with a vulnerability and a femininity that made the character memorable. And Jane Fonda could not have done it. She wouldn't have worked. Kubrick was exactly right. His Jack Torrance was going to be this very masculine, almost frightening, domineering character. And Kubrick was adamant that a woman like Jane Fonda would not stay with Jack Torrance. The kind of relationship that Kubrick saw in the novel was kind of an inherent power dynamic where Wendy gave in to Jack as much as possible in order to keep the peace. And so Kubrick liked Shelley Duvall's unusual combination of she was attractive and almost elegant in one sense, but then she had this clumsy or mundane sort of look, a combination that was interesting. She was apparently from Fort Worth, and so that would explain her accent. Now, I imagine some of my listeners were surprised when I used the word attractive to describe Shelley Duvall. And that's something I've noticed that's interesting. Studies show that what straight men perceive as attractive in women more or less overlaps with what women perceive as attractive in women. In other words, women not only predicting what straight men might like, but also what they themselves find personally attractive. Like I said, there's mostly a big overlap, but there are some edge cases where you find the genders are divided on a particular person. And I don't want to stir up controversy and ugly feelings by talking about famous women that a lot of men don't really find attractive, but women seem to think that they are attractive, or vice versa, or all that stuff. But I will say that I've noticed that men respond to Shelley Duvall's portrayal of Wendy in terms of her behavior, her look, her style of dress. Their response to her is much more positive than what I've seen with the typical female viewer. Women tend not to like this portrayal of Wendy, and they tend to find her annoying and even weak, which, again, I'll argue against that pretty forcefully later on. She is not a weak character. She's just very retiring and withdrawing and feminine in terms of her personal demeanor. And there's nothing wrong with that. As somebody who's kind of the opposite, naturally, I find it kind of annoying when people just have just an inherent problem with the fact that I'm sort of outgoing and I tend to have ideas about how things should go. So Kubrick hired her because he liked her look. He thought that she would embody his Wendy the best. And then it appears that Kubrick also had a high estimation of her acting ability. Kubrick didn't want to work with someone who didn't know what they were doing, someone who was just a pretty face. Shelley Duvall had been working in successful films since 1971. So she was not the ingenue. She was not the latest super thin person that Hollywood was pushing in the late 70s. She had done some highly critically acclaimed work with a director named Robert Altman. Very artsy 1970s movies that I have never seen, like Nashville or Three Women. And so Kubrick did not see her as inexperienced. He did not see her as a slouch. And he hired her because he thought that she could tackle the realism that he wanted. However, as we'll see, he would end up clashing with Shelley Duvall about what realism meant. Because Shelley Duvall's acting style and all of her work up to that point was extremely naturalistic. Her style was, this is real life. I'm giving you reality and authenticity. She was 100% dyed-in-the-wool, a creature of the new Hollywood, the counterculture. So in terms of their professional and artistic position, Kubrick and Duvall couldn't be more different. And so I think this was a cultural clash. It was a collision between Kubrick's male-dominated old studio style of directing and Shelley Duvall's experience, which was much more relaxed in terms of the behind-the-scenes work ethic and also how over-the-top or cinematic things were supposed to be on screen. You wanted to capture the boring, gritty elements of real life. At least, that's what other directors were trying to do in the 1970s. But not Kubrick. Kubrick seems to have immediately become concerned about Shelley Duvall's ability to scream and cry and do all the emotions that he needed toward the end of the film. And so, starting at the very beginning of shooting, when they were doing the less intense scenes like Wendy and Danny skipping through the maze, during that time, it has pretty much been confirmed that Kubrick did have a discussion with some chief members of his crew, and he appointed one person to be sort of the quote-unquote good cop for Shelley in case she needed something. But he told everyone else to be, quote-unquote, shitty to Shelley. Shitty to Shelley. That was the instructions. Everybody has to be shitty to Shelley. And that was the exact word that was used. Because Kubrick did not think that she had the acting endurance to maintain the right vibe, shot after shot, later in the production of the film. And so he wanted Shelley Duvall to start feeling isolated in real life to help her with her acting. So by being shitty to Shelley, Kubrick was actually trying to be nice to her. He was trying to make her work easier. So, I mean, come on. He's just a big, lovable dad trying to be helpful. And that brings us to sort of, not really the elephant in the room, but maybe the mouse, a smaller topic that needs to be mentioned, and that is, let's keep it 100, as the young folks say, or they did say 5 years ago, I guess. Let's keep it a bean, keep it a buck. There might be something about the name Shelley. I mean, think about it. Think real hard. Are there any good Shelleys? No offense to any Shelleys who might be listening right now, but I just wanted to say that my grandmother had a saying, when I was a kid, all the time, she'd tell me, "Whoa, Nelly, watch out for a Shelly." So I think that the Shelley Duvall Stanley Kubrick conflict has been a little bit spun out of proportion. Shelley Duvall herself says she doesn't blame Stanley Kubrick for the mental health problems that she had later in life. Acting is a weird job. It's emotionally stressful by nature. It's a mentally taxing job. I think, strangely, there might be some sexism in how people view this issue because they tend to see Shelley Duvall, especially as she's inhabiting the character of Wendy Torrance, with that particular hairstyle and those clothes and the caved-in shoulders and the mousy, beat-down demeanor. And then they see Kubrick, this big, bearded, domineering, older man, and they immediately see sort of the victim and oppressor sort of dynamic. But I look past Duvall's costume, and what I see is a very talented performer who is being squeezed hard by a director who's trying to get a particular performance out of them. But just bear in mind that Shelley Duvall wasn't foisted on Kubrick because she was the producer's girlfriend. I mean, Kubrick was the producer. I think in some cases his brother-in-law would do some of the producer work, but it was basically Kubrick. So no, Kubrick picked Shelley Duvall, and he picked her for professional reasons, and he expected a certain caliber of performance from her. And it seems like he wasn't disappointed in her actual acting ability, but really just her style and work ethic. So yes, Kubrick was deliberately shitty to Shelley, and I think that was a counterproductive and short-sighted tactic. And I think it does reflect Kubrick's overall failure in terms of how well he dealt with people. I do think that overall, the conflict with Shelley Duvall was Kubrick's fault. He could have done better. He may have gotten a better performance out of her if he had used better methods. It was not his finest hour. From what I can tell, Kubrick saw actors as a special kind of artisan, like a violinist or a painter, or some kind of performer like a dancer or a model or an acrobat. Kubrick's approach was getting on set and talking to them and telling the actors to stand here and do this and be more like that. Stand there better. Do that better. And it can be kind of annoying for a normal person to watch this process. And you see all of the nitpicky details and the little marionette strings that the director, the costume designer, the makeup artist, the other actors are all pulling, trying to get the actor to imitate what they're seeing in their heads. But actors actually crave that in a lot of cases. I've worked a little bit with actors, but a lot more with models. And in particular, actors who were dabbling in modeling or who needed headshots. And one thing I can confidently say about models and performers like that is that they do want some direction. Their worst jobs are the kind where someone just has them show up, give them an outline of what they want, and just sort of have them do it over and over and over again. Now, of course, you can have too many notes, and you can be a micromanager, and you can sort of squeeze the life out of the performance. And I think that's what Kubrick had a tendency to do. Actors like a lot of instruction up to a certain point. They just want their emotional map or their emotional imagination fleshed out so they can explore the space, as I said before. I think a director who is a good example of working with actors would be Steven Spielberg. He's famous for working with actors from a broad range of the talent scale. He's worked with near amateurs, and then, of course, some of the best actors of all time. And famously, Spielberg has kind of made a cottage industry out of being good with child actors. Now, there was one clip from the behind the scenes of the making of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And in that footage, you can see Steven Spielberg directing Karen Allen through a very difficult solo scene that she had, where she was trapped in a pit full of mummies. A room that was wall-to-wall, dried-out husks of half-decomposed bodies from thousands of years ago. And so Karen Allen was working very hard to try to express the emotional extremity of a character who was that terrified and exhausted, which is a magic combination that should sound familiar now. It's that magic sweet spot of emotion that Shelley Duvall had to maintain for months at a time. Karen Allen was having a little trouble satisfying what Spielberg had in mind for the scene. And instead of just having Karen Allen do it 50 times, Spielberg told her, hey, I need more from you, more extreme, more emotion. They ran the scene again, and she did give more emotion, but it wasn't quite where Spielberg wanted. And he took her to the side, and he said, okay, look, that was good. You did give me more, but you gave me about an inch more, and I want a yard more. And he stretched his arms out real wide to show the extreme. And here's another thing that I thought of. If I were an actor like Karen Allen, and I were on the set with Stanley Kubrick, and I could tell that he was not getting what he wanted, I don't know that I would trust him enough to really cut loose in that pit of skeletons on the first few takes, because I wouldn't want to use up all my energy, and I'd want to get a sense of what direction he wanted to go. Now, the documentary cuts right after Spielberg's instruction to Karen Allen, but Spielberg was famous for guiding actors skillfully and respectfully through the scenes. And I think part of Spielberg's success and reputation has to do with the fact that actors trust him. They trust him not to waste their energy. They trust him to tell them exactly what he wants, and also let them experiment and test the boundaries of the scene as actors. But now we've got to turn our attention back to Mr. Kubrick, and one of the most famous examples of his relentless perfectionism, and that's the stairs scene. Also, I suppose, referred to as the bat scene. This is the scene where Wendy finally has confirmed that her husband, Jack, has completely lost it, and that he is probably going to hurt her and their son. Now, the rumor is that this scene took 127 takes. I dug around, and it seems like that 127 takes figure is exaggerated by about a factor of 2. So there were really only 60 takes. Now, when you have 60 takes, you got to put the word only in quotes, because that's a crazy amount of takes. Now, we'll talk about why Kubrick did so many takes, and also, I think, a kind of unfair way of counting the takes that expands that number. Kubrick will go through a scene with actors about a dozen times on set before they even roll any film. Remember, this is decades before you could record the movie onto a solid-state hard drive. In this world, you're using very expensive film when you're rolling. But Kubrick ran thousands of feet of film that day to get that scene exactly right, and to get the scaling up of the emotion to match perfectly with the two characters moving up the stairs. Kubrick wanted every swing of the bat to be at the perfect angle, and the strikes have to be realistic, and everything has to be timed perfectly so that you can have a matched shot where Jack Nicholson's very convincing stunt double can take a tumble down the stairs after the blow to the head. So there were a lot of factors that had to be lined up. And both Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson had to be turned up to 11 for that scene. And also, you got to look at it from the perspective of a storyteller. If that scene does not work, if that scene is not iconic, the whole movie could fail. And so Kubrick ensured that the scene had an emotional raggedness and an extremity by doing so many takes that Shelley Duvall's hands were shaking from exhaustion in some of the final shots. That sort of cartoonish weakness and that frail, weak way that she was swinging the bat. That was genuine. That was real. It wasn't acting. Her hands were blistered the next day. There were prop bats that you could get. They looked exactly like baseball bats on screen, but they weighed only about 10% as much as a real baseball bat. But Kubrick wouldn't let Shelley Duvall use a prop bat because he said you could tell that the physics weren't right. If she were to swing a bat that was only 10% as heavy as a regular bat, you'd definitely be able to tell. It wouldn't look right. And Duvall wouldn't be as tired in the later takes. Now, I've come across multiple stories of people talking about Kubrick doing take after take after take in order to sort of punish the actor or force them to learn their lines and teach them a thing or two about being a professional. And I have no doubt that there's some truth to these stories. But I think that most of the time, the multiple takes was just trying to get lightning in a bottle, just trying to get all the variables to align perfectly for that perfect shot. Another famous example of the many takes in The Shining was the conversation near the beginning of the film between Dick Halloran, the chief cook of the Overlook Hotel, and Danny Torrance, Jack and Wendy's young son, who has some special abilities. Well, that scene took 148 takes. It took all day, and Scatman Crothers, the actor who played Dick Halloran, he apparently was holding back tears at the end of the day, and Kubrick started to feel bad for him because the number of takes was partly his fault, but not entirely. The child actor, who was great by the way, and Kubrick praised him, and people even today say, wow, that's some of the best child acting I've ever seen. But both the kid and Scatman Crothers had trouble with their lines, and not just because one was maybe an elderly man and the other one was a kid, but because Kubrick kept changing the script. He kind of rethought each scene as it went into pre-production, because new ideas came to him after he had casted the actors and after seeing the sets in person. Then he would bring the actors onto the set and do rehearsals to figure out the best blocking. And as they did this, he would continue to change the lines. He would often go back and rewrite the script for that scene so that if you worked for Stanley Kubrick, you could show up one morning to tackle one or a couple of scenes, and you find out, oh, now I have new lines to memorize. So there was that problem. And the lighting is pretty flat in that scene because it's in a brightly lit industrial kitchen. So we didn't have to worry about shadows or getting good Rembrandt lighting on someone's face. This was about the emotion. The emotion of Halloran talking about his childhood, the subtle fear and deception when he talks about the Overlook with Danny. So there was a lot to cover. I guess I'm trying to defend Kubrick in some ways, but then also acknowledging his shortcomings in others, especially when it came to people. I can't find a major shortcoming of Kubrick when it comes to the technical side of filmmaking, how to do sound, or how to photograph a scene. But, as I mentioned before, I do kind of have some problems with the choices made in The Shining, and my problems start with the first frame, with those long helicopter shots of Jack driving in his yellow Volkswagen Beetle in the Rocky Mountains. Now, I complained about the baby blue Comic Sans credits displayed over a blue sky. That doesn't make sense because you're never supposed to mix two different hues of blue. All the blues in an image have to be the same kind of blue. The same applies to reds and pinks. Then I also had a problem with the music choice. I thought that the music was kind of strange, that sort of classical music filtered through a synthesizer, and it kind of sets the same mood as his previous two films. I would choose different music for the opening. Sure, that stern, weird, creepy music sets a particular tone, but I think that movies should show a development. I think that's one thing that you can say that's good about Christopher Nolan's movies, is that the tone and the condition of the characters at the beginning of his films are totally different from at the end. His movies really put his characters through a major transformation. That's not always true with Kubrick's films, but for The Shining, I'd want to show that. And so the movie kind of ends on a downer note. It's not a happy, fun-paced, comical romp. It's not a feel-good movie. So I'd want to start it off that way. And so, what would I do? What would you do, Mr. Smarty Pants, if you were going to one-up Kubrick and tell him how to make his movie? Well, we're casting some popular actors, and we're swinging for the fences in terms of box office because we've got a hot intellectual property that's going to appeal to young people and give them a good popcorn movie to go to. So I'd go ahead and say, let's bring in a popular musician, and who was popular at that time, and had a connection with the Rocky Mountains and with Colorado. That would be none other than John Denver. John Denver was hugely popular. Maybe his most famous song is Country Road. So I'd go to John Denver, otherwise known as John Deutschendorf, and I'd say, all right, Johnny D, I need a song. I need you to kick that songwriting genius into gear. Here's the script, or at least the latest version that Kubrick would let me read. And here's the title. For the Caretaker, Duty Calls. No, that's not the name of the movie. That's the name of the song I want you to write. I know you like to name the songs yourself, but since I wrote the lyrics for you, I need you to not be a dick for like 2 seconds. Is that cool with you? And so that's what I'd do. And with the magic of AI, I could realize that dream. And for just a few minutes, I can pretend that I'm as good as Stanley Kubrick, that I outsmarted him, and that I created a better beginning for his so-called masterpiece than he could ever come up with. Let's take a listen and imagine this song playing over those beautiful shots of the Rockies, and Jack Torrance heading for his job interview. And so, here's our title song, For the Caretaker, Duty Calls.
Comic Sans painted blue on the sky. These mountain roads made Wendy cry. On these windy, rocky peaks, to the home of some evil freaks. Feel like coming home again on this winding mountain trail to the place I've always been, a mile-high purgatory wide, and the sun who's shining bright. Painful memories haunt these halls, for the caretaker duty calls. Almost heaven, this retreat, native bones beneath my feet. Bathtub lady cold and green, twins are stealing every scene. I broke the radio we had, now she can't call, that's too bad. Brady taught them wrong from right, I'll teach that lesson here tonight. Feel like coming home again on this winding mountain trail to the place I've always been, a mile-high purgatory wide, and a sun who's shining bright. Painful memories haunt these halls, for the caretaker duty calls.
Well, that was interesting. Now, I do realize that the lyrics of that song do spoil some aspects of the movie, or so some people think. They might think, Vincent, that's a dumb way to open your movie. But that's where you'd be wrong. Because I think some of your unsophisticated viewers or uninitiated audience members might see this as a goofy song full of spoilers. But I think of these lyrics as Chekhov's lyrics. They're just foreshadowing, really. And, how dare you question me? I'm the director. What I say goes, no matter how weird. So, let's now all pretend that we've opened the film to Vincent's satisfaction. Vincent likes the opening now. And after that enormous sense of relief that Vincent is happy, let's pretend that we all just actually watched the movie and the end credits just rolled. And now we're all thinking, what the hell just happened? I think the fundamental story here is that this hotel is sort of possessed. It's kind of inhabited by some sort of demonic being that collects souls. People are sort of trapped forever in this hotel. They actually become a part of it. So that's kind of creepy. It also seems to want to absorb certain people more than others. It likes to absorb people who have psychic abilities. And in the film, most people theorize, and in part based on the novel, that the hotel wanted Danny. It wanted Jack to kill Danny so that it could absorb his power. Jack appears to have this ability called the Shining, like his son. However, his jaded adulthood and his consumption of alcohol have dulled those powers over time. And so, Jack's son Danny is a better prize. Now, what makes this a little bit complicated are the subtle signs. I would call them red herrings, but other people think of them as indicators that all of the activity in the movie really just happened all in the characters' heads. And this is revealed by the role of reflections and mirrors in the story. The first example of this is the little boy, Danny Torrance, in the Torrance's apartment. Before they even go to the Overlook, he has a vision while looking into his bathroom mirror. Then later, when Jack Torrance is wandering through the hotel, angry and frustrated at his wife and his life, and the lack of alcohol, and he wanders into the gold room, and he looks at himself in the large mirrors of the back bar of the elegant, well-appointed bar of the gold room. Notice that in the shot, Jack Nicholson's character is looking in the mirror when he starts laughing, and he says, "A little slow tonight." So shots like that indicate that some of this may be internal or related to self-reflection of some kind. Then, famously, the strange word red rum, REDRUM, is written on a door, and just in the nick of time, someone sees the door in a mirror and realizes that the message is actually murder, MURDER. And once again, I have to give more praise to Daniel Lloyd, the young boy who played Danny Torrance. And he was one of the few people whose acting in this movie was actually praised. And as far as we can see, he was one of the only members of the crew that Kubrick was nice to, with the exception of telling him over and over again to look scared, more scared. Now, why did he have to keep telling this kid to be more scared, to look more scared in each shot? Well, that's because Daniel Lloyd had not read the script. He didn't know any details about the story, other than he was a kid stuck in that hotel while his parents were fighting. Daniel Lloyd didn't see the movie until he was 17, and the cool thing is that Stanley Kubrick attended Daniel Lloyd's high school graduation. So Kubrick was determined to keep the kid away from the creepy, gory parts. The child actor, Daniel Lloyd, never saw the elevators full of blood. He never saw Jack Nicholson swinging an axe. Kubrick even kept the kid away from the more intense scenes between his parents, even the ones that didn't really involve violence, but that did involve some of the darker themes of the movie. A good example is the scene after Danny appears to have sustained an injury, and Wendy confronts Jack Torrance about the injury and begins to suspect that Jack actually did it. Now, in that scene, we see Wendy Torrance, played by Shelley Duvall, holding Danny while yelling, "How could you? How could you?" And then she picks Danny up and walks away. Now, that was not actually Daniel Lloyd. It was a pretty convincing dummy, because Kubrick figured he only needed the kid for that one brief shot at the end of the discussion, so there was no need to have him be on set and hear all the weird stuff that his co-stars would be talking about. But here's the first thing I thought of when I thought about the dummy that Kubrick had made to look like the child actor. I'm thinking that based on what we found out from the story about the baseball bat, there's no way in hell that that dummy didn't weigh at least what the child actor weighed. Because, of course, if the dummy wasn't super heavy, then the physics wouldn't look right. The audience can tell. And so I imagine that maybe it went something like this.
Yes, I know that was take 37, Shelly. But I need to see that combination of exhaustion and terror that I have yet to see from you today. And that is precisely why I can't make the dummy any lighter. We weighed Daniel, and that dummy is exactly that weight. Plus 50 pounds, because I wanted to see that exhaustion, that hopelessness, watching the horror unfold. And you're powerless to stop it. And this madman is just terrorizing you day after day, until you almost feel like you're going insane. I mean, you've probably never experienced anything like that in real life, but you'll have to imagine it for the scene. Okay? Can you do that? Great. And can we get more menthol for Shelly? Her eyes aren't red enough. And let's go ahead and bring in Heavy Danny. Heavy Danny is another dummy I had made, which has a uranium skeleton that gives it an extra 100 pounds, while maintaining Daniel's body proportions exactly.
Now, let me go ahead and add that I have no evidence for the existence of a Heavy Danny. As far as I know, the dummy was no heavier than the real Daniel Lloyd. Kubrick did not commission a dummy to be constructed using a depleted uranium alloy for a skeleton. But, I thought it'd be cute. It's an example of how far he's willing to go. And while the child actor, Daniel Lloyd, got some of the best treatment from Kubrick, and of course, as we discussed, Shelley Duvall, quite purposely, got the worst of Kubrick, as we saw, the other actors were scattered on a spectrum in between these two. In terms of their treatment from Kubrick, they were somewhere in between the two extremes of Daniel Lloyd and Shelley Duvall. A good example is the veteran British actor who plays Delbert Grady. And in the next episode, we'll talk about some of the weird theories about the movie and about how Delbert Grady may not be the same person as Charles Grady. But anyway, Jack Torrance runs into the guy during a ghost party in the Gold Room, and Delbert Grady is at the party for some reason, working as a waiter, carrying trays of cocktails around while wearing a tuxedo. Not exactly what you'd expect the caretaker of the hotel to be doing, but I guess that's part of the job that he has to do there at the hotel for all eternity, I guess. It's an example of how the hotel has enslaved his spirit as punishment for his crimes. But if you've seen the movie, you know that Mr. Grady runs into Jack Torrance and spills a cocktail on his jacket. And the cocktail is this Dutch monstrosity called Advocaat. 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 And it's this pale yellow goopy stuff that seems to have the consistency of eggnog because it is an alcoholic beverage. It's a liqueur, but it has eggs in it, which gives it its really awesome texture. I've never had Advocaat. But once again, I can't help but think that Kubrick chose this cocktail, A, because it's one of those gross, old-fashioned drinks that people chugged after Prohibition. And it's also bright yellow, which will show up quite well on camera on Jack Torrance's dark maroon jacket or Mr. Grady's black tuxedo jacket. And then, of course, Mr. Grady wants to help Jack clean his jacket. So they go into the nearest restroom. Which, if you remember this restroom, is quite different in decor from the Gold Room. Gone is the 1920s Gilded era opulence and all the decorative touches that you would see back then. We suddenly walk into a restroom that's very spare and contemporary. There are no decorative elements. Everything is purely functional, with the exception of the colors. There's literally just two colors in this room. From about the chest up, the walls and the ceiling are white, and then from about the chest down, everything is bright red, a very deep red. Kubrick spent a lot of time settling down on the exact kind of red that he wanted, and in his notes, next to the red that he chose, it appears that he referred to it as arterial red. So basically he wanted the bathroom to suggest blood to the audience. Now, of course, this is on a soundstage, and the little bit of light that's supposed to be sunlight coming through the tiny windows, which, again, by the way, doesn't make sense if you study the layout of the hotel to the extent that there is one. You'll see, once again, that the room doesn't make sense in terms of architecture. So we're in this room, and of course, Jack Torrance realizes that he's talking to the ghost of the old caretaker, and the actor who plays Delbert Grady has to be kind of creepy and off-putting and scary, while at the same time being cordial and formal and friendly. I think this guy nails it, and that's quite an achievement. His classical theatrical training kicked in. It's not an accident that Kubrick had casted him twice. This was the guy who played Alex DeLarge's father in A Clockwork Orange. And it's cool to see the contrast. You can really see this actor's range because he's kind of an almost lovable doofus in A Clockwork Orange. And then he's this weird, terrifying father figure murderer in this movie. Now, the lights on that bathroom set were much brighter in person than they seem on the screen. And that's important to know because Kubrick told the actor who plays Grady not to blink at all during the scene. And of course, if you've watched the movie, you know that there are a couple of very long takes. And if you've ever worked in front of bright lights, you know that they can make your eyes tired, and keeping them open becomes a chore, and they'll eventually start to water and fight you to get rest. And so this actor ran into that problem. And what do you know? Kubrick broke out the old eye drops. He had a production assistant stand right outside a frame, and between takes, he'd put some sort of Visine-type compound on the actor's eyes to keep them from turning red. Of course, Kubrick always wanted Shelley Duvall's eyes to be red on the set. But Delbert Grady was supposed to be sort of this cold, standoffish figure who doesn't show emotion, aside from a very cold, calculating kind of wrath. I can't help but think about the irony that the actor who played Alex DeLarge's father ends up getting the eye drop treatment from Kubrick in a later film. Another thing to note about this scene is that, of course, this is a sort of transformative moment where Jack starts to accept his role as the new caretaker. And this is underlined by what Delbert Grady tells him when Grady says, "You are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker." The way Kubrick starts to express this weird, illogical duality and confusion on the screen is by breaking one of the rules of visual storytelling. Anytime you see a scene in a movie where one person is standing toward the right of the screen and the other person is standing on the left, whenever you cut to close-ups of these guys, the camera has to stay on the same side of the line created when you connect the two actors on the set. So basically, that's a long-winded geometric way of saying keep actors on the same side of the screen whenever you're intercutting. If in one cut, the actor's way on the right, and then because you moved the camera, all of a sudden that character teleports to the left side of the screen after a cut, then that's going to confuse and disorient the audience. Now, Kubrick does this on purpose because he's trying to confuse the viewer, and he wants to have these cuts where the viewer is expecting Jack Torrance to be in one place, then all of a sudden Grady is there, and vice versa. So your brain starts to tell you something's wrong here, and it has to do with the relationship between these two characters. Now, I know about this rule because I broke it. When I was a film major and working for Texas Student Television, I had recorded a brief conversation between two people, not on high-quality film like Stanley Kubrick, but on high-8 videotape using a prosumer camcorder. But anyway, I loved all my shots. They looked great, but when I edited them together, I had violated that rule and didn't realize it. And I got some negative feedback about that. I remember that rule for that very reason. And I guess once you're at Stanley Kubrick's level, you can break those kinds of rules, especially if you have a good reason. Okay, so it looks like we may not get to the theories in this episode. Sorry about that, folks. I just get so excited about camera positioning rules and the color of the paint on bathroom walls. Just kind of my thing. So, before I sign off for today, let's talk about how would I end the movie. I definitely had some brilliant ideas about how to start the movie. Now, how would I approach the ending? It kind of ends on a low-energy note. First of all, at the end, before his final ending, I would have Jack cry out, "Wendy, you can't do this to me! Get back here, Wendy!" Something like that. Something to show that, even at the very end, he was blaming her for everything. Kubrick wrestled with the ending of the movie. In fact, he had shot an epilogue of the hotel manager, Mr. Ullman, coming to visit Wendy and to apologize for what happened. Maybe he was worried about a lawsuit? But Kubrick cut that and decided to end the film on the dolly in on the photograph. Now here's my thought. You can't end a blockbuster like that. A good example of how to end a blockbuster that has a complex and maybe negative ending would be Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. If you recall, in that film, the Joker kind of wins. He drives Harvey Dent insane and causes all this havoc and mayhem in the city. And so, Nolan knew you had to do something to get the audience to leave the theater energized and in a positive mood. And so not only did the movie end with the very rousing and energetic score from Hans Zimmer, he added this long, strange monologue from Gary Oldman, who plays Commissioner Gordon. And Commissioner Gordon talks to his son about the nature of Batman and what kind of hero he is. And he even ends with the name of the movie, A Dark Knight. I think that The Dark Knight has one of the best endings in movie history. Yeah, I mean, I talk down about Nolan here and there, but the dude's good. I like his stuff. I'm gonna have a serious problem with The Odyssey this July, I think. But, I'll have to put that out of my mind. Maybe as a kind of counter-programming, I'll do a series about the original Greek text of the Odyssey and how it was performed and how the characters were conceived in the imaginations of ancient people. So I wouldn't want to give Shelley Duvall a long monologue to say to Danny about how he needs to live his own life and look on the bright side or some kind of positive garbage like that. So without a monologue, what do? Well, I've got an idea. How about ending with a catchy song that would get the audience up and dancing their way out of the theater? So let's imagine we just watched the movie and, we're kind of in that weird downer kind of mood. But that's going to change. Get ready to leave the theater clapping your hands and stomping your feet. And here's the song. It's called Heads Down, Eyes Up. Here we go.
Staying at the Overlook tonight. Ain't no way it's gonna be alright. Elevators full of blood. Ain't never a pretty sight. Jack never gave you flowers. Like to swing an axe instead. He don't wanna be done no more. Here's Johnny, is what he said. Head down, eyes up. That's how I rock, that's how we roll. Head down, eyes up. Head down. This hotel gon' eat your soul. I'ma get down in this joint. Now go get your best suit on. My tuxedo is on point. You can't be just another John. Jack never gave you flowers. Like to swing an axe instead. He don't wanna be done no more. Here's Johnny, it's what he said. Head down, eyes up. That's how I rock, that's how we roll. Head down, eyes up. Head down. This hotel gon' eat your soul. Give me a red wine and coke. Got my night, this ain't no joke. Got my targets in the maze. Chin tuck, my eyes are crazed. Stand at the Overlook tonight. Ain't no way it's gonna be alright. Elevators full of blood. Ain't never a pretty sight. Head down, eyes up. That's how I rock, that's how we roll. Head down, eyes up. Head down. This hotel gon' eat your soul.
I think that would be fun. That kind of song you'd have to farm out to someone like James Brown, who was probably at the peak of his career around this time. You know, with a song like that, you could go the Ghostbusters route. In 1983, or it may have been 1984, a musician named Ray Parker Jr. hit it big with the theme to Ghostbusters. To this day, when a lot of people hear Who You Gonna Call, they can't help but hear Ghostbusters in the back of their mind. So we'd go for that kind of thing. I think that would make the movie a lot more popular. Okay, so in the next episode, we'll talk about the Here's Johnny scene. We'll talk more about the maze. And then we'll talk about all the theories that have collected around this film over the years as it developed a cult following. And Kubrick's own personal, strange, reclusive behavior, his fussy, obsessive work ethic, and the extreme subject matter of his films led to theories about his intentions, what the movies really mean, what messages he may have planted in them for very, very sharp viewers. And a lot of these theories have to do with some supposed connection or exclusive knowledge that Kubrick had about the deep state. So in the next episode, we're going to have to talk about the Holocaust, the moon landing, the genocide of Native Americans. These are all central ideas in the theories about The Shining and what it really means. We'll also talk more about the characters and who they are and what they're doing in the story and what various people have thought about them. And speaking of what people thought, we'll talk about the release of the film, the reception of the film from critics and from the audience. Then we'll lay the groundwork for Full Metal Jacket. There isn't a full-blown short film about the making of Full Metal Jacket, but there is a lot of information. That's where we're headed next time. And so, until then, talk to you later.